So today I got a fun little project I want to introduce, and it's style scores. And this has been something I've been working on for a while with turds. I've probably made some progress on it since I post this video because we're not quite done with the scoring, and there's some stuff we're probably gonna tweak some stuff. But anyways, the point is, we take the moves people play, just the move orders. There's no evaluation of how good the moves are, but we looked at different moves in different setups and structures, from move 1 through move 4 of basically every game we could find. I could find various players in my records, and scored each move on 2 axes. We scored them whether they were defensive or aggressive. Now, we didn't go game by game, so instead we might have said something like, if there's a starter in 1, playing next to it without capturing it is usually high facing out, is usually a kind of defensive move. Playing next to it while capturing it might be a more aggressive move, that kind of thing. And we took like every option, meeting a corner with an adjacent corner, meeting it with the opposite corner. And we scored every single one as more aggressive or more defensive. Of course, each use of a move could vary, but I'm hoping that over time, over a number of games, it's going to be quite telling. Having to look specifically at each move and score it would be incredibly work intensive. But being able to put in, 50 games a player has played and said, okay, we scored these moves this way, these moves that way, it's probably going to add up to something kind of interesting about their play. So we have aggressive and defensive, and I might think of aggressive and defensive a little differently than you do, so I want to talk a little about that, because I think some people think of aggressive as capturing. I think of defensive as playing kind of to support your cards on the board. Play something that has strong outfacing, play something safe, something hard for them to take, play something that locks in other cards of yours. And I tend to think of playing aggressively as not quite so much capturing, because obviously capturing to lock in a card seems to me, if anything, defensive, but it could be some of both. But aggressive more playing to control their hand and to control the board against future cards. So something that sets up a really dangerous combo is likely to be counted as an aggressive move, right? It says, here's a square you might want to occupy. I'm going to make combos make that very dangerous for you, right? That's going to be the kind of move that strikes me as aggressive. So moves setting up more combo potential, moves setting up to control new squares on the board where the cards haven't been played yet. Moves of that type are going to strike me as a lot more aggressive. Though captures can, of course, lean aggressive as well. Generally, plays in corners are going to be a little more defensive, while plays in sides, unless more surrounded, or plays in the center, are going to lean more aggressive. Our other axis is concrete versus intuitive. And I think of this kind of as a concrete move is one that forces the action, is one that says, capturing like a corner starter, you capture it. It says, you got to capture something back. You got to play in this specific square, and I have some plan against that. I have a specific plan against the move I expect you to play. An intuitive move might be something more like, okay, I'm not sure exactly what's coming next. There's a lot of options. I'm happy for there to be a lot of options, but I have set up ways for my cards to combine effectively, or I have played a card that synergizes nicely with my other cards on the board, and I think that's going to prove sufficient. That can, of course, overlap with setting up combo things, but it can overlap with playing defensively too. And so there's kind of 4 quadrants and I've labeled each of the quadrants, and there's a label in each one. So we have intuitive but defensive. And I think this tends to be, you're focusing more on your own cards and how they work together, but you're not doing specifically forcing lines. So you're probably setting up a lot of combo potential within your own hand, but it's not so much looking to control what their hand is doing. It's looking to make sure stuff works really well within your own hand. And his stats will sort of put him here, not as strongly as I might have expected, but we don't have a big sample of his games. But I was sort of thinking of Piggy Man as an example of this category. Clearly a defensive player, one really focusing on how his cards work together and how he feels they're going to work as the game goes on. Really synergistic player. I think of this as kind of the Piggy Man quadrant. Top right, Chaotic, aggressive, and intuitive. So setting up lots of moves that allow tons of options, but you have so much combo control and threat against squares they could play that you are creating this very complicated, wide open game where you're okay conceding combos to the opponent because you're creating even more combos for yourself or pressure on the squares that they'd want to play on. I think there are a number of Brotherhood of Seed players that move in this direction, at least for my taste. This is not a quadrant I end up in here or am likely to play all that near. Chaotic might sound like the least complimentary of these terms, but chaotic players are very fun to watch. When thinking about this, he ended up actually, again, not scoring here so strongly, but I was thinking of him when thinking about the quadrant. I think Villalba has a very chaotic style. An example that came to mind of mine was a game where there were cards in 6 and 9, and he played in 4, setting up a threat in 5, but had counters if I went in 5 myself. I tried to calm the waters in 8, blocking the squared counter, and he went in 2, setting up more combos everywhere. And it's that kind of thing that strikes me as really chaotic play, and it can lead to very dangerous positions for both players, but is very combative. Moves a lot of play through 5, right? Because 5 is going to be the highest combo potential square. So we have chaotic. Then we have aggressive but concrete. So this is looking to attack cards and put pressure on their hand and cards on the board, but it's looking to do so in a way that has clear lines resulting, right? I capture, that forces you to capture back. Then I can play here setting up big combos. I'm playing to put pressure on your stuff, but I'm doing so in a way that tries to keep everything narrow, tries to keep it direct, is not expansive. There's not a million possibilities. And we'll get to examples here. And the last one is defensive and concrete, going for clear goals and generally trying to achieve safety, trying to achieve those defensive goals of locking in cards. This is where I expected to land. We'll get to where I and some other players did. I'm going to use some examples that have a lot of games in the database, so these are very top-end players. I'm happy if you're curious where you land to look through whoever's last 20, 30 games I have on record and see where you'd land. But I want to put in a few players, and I want to put in a few for each quadrant to give a kind of feel of where it ends up. So one idea I actually didn't think of having, or didn't think of doing, but came to mind, but was thought of, was Reyes said, where do the bots go? And 2 bots, you might see this coming. We're going to put in Deuce. Deuce ends up as quite a chaotic player. And Deuce should now appear on the chart. There we go. Deuce, very chaotic player, very intuitive, trying to set up so many combos, not looking to force the action, setting up a ton of potential. I'm actually capping the scores at 1, but Deuce's score would actually be 1.7, which is way off the charts, as we'll see. Very few, I don't think I have a single score on record that far off the chart. Another quite chaotic player is Joker. We will put Joker in now. Joker is also off the chart on intuitive, but not quite as far. So Joker is going to look more extremely this style, but if I enlarge the chart, which I won't do because it would make other things look hard to differentiate, Deuce is probably farther up there than Joker is off to the right, but these are 2 very chaotic bots out there. Another example of a chaotic player is Midas in tournaments. His tournament record in the return lands him as a chaotic player, not nearly as far as these 2 are, but enough that he's one of the only players that ends up in this spectrum. So I'm going to put the T there to signify this is his tournament record. A bunch of players have quite different styles in tournaments and randoms. Their move sequences look really different. This may be somewhat that the tournaments are smaller samples than we have for randoms, but it is interesting to see players change over time. And I think Midas is a player who quite often goes off the beaten path of formations to find different ways to set something up. And while he also is very comfortable playing in standard formations, him landing as a chaotic player, to me, felt right. felt somewhat validating of the system. So that's examples in the chaotic sector. Let's look at the synergy sector. I intended this section to be where Piggy ended up, and so let's put him in next. I have to type in the scores so they appear. He wasn't as strongly as I expected him to be, but he does land just barely here in the synergy sector. And I would expect as games went up, or maybe as we tweak the system, him to move a little up and stay comfortably left of center. The bots, because they are more formulaic than humans are going to end up more extremely in different directions than humans will. Another player that landed in the synergy section was Delial in tournaments. And I think this also makes sense as something where, as he's building hands, he starts to focus more on synergy than he would otherwise, and his style lands more over you here. And you can see he's basically just in the same spot Piggyman is. Did I have a third example for synergy? Yes, I did. Vialva, who, as I said, I thought of as a really chaos player, in tournaments has moved into the synergy section, but I think this makes sense too. I remember the hands he built for Carver were in the finals against Turds, and I think he played a great finals against Turds. Of the finals I have on record, basically all of them were played badly, except the Turds Vialva finals. It was the only really fantastically played, wonderful finals we have on record. And in that, he built hands around number combos and looked to play in 5 and trust his hands to play off that. And I think he built some really interesting hands. If you haven't watched those games, those are good videos to find. And I think those games where he played really, really well pushed him into this sector of the board. And so we also have Vialva landing in the synergy section. A ton of players landed very slightly in the synergy section, but not strongly, right? The little marker that says synergy was way farther in that direction than any human seems to have landed of people I've checked so far. Now, I expected to land personally in the safety part, and my random performances did. So we'll include me next. Interestingly, and I've been thinking this more and more as I've watched him play recently in random, Deli ended up looking in random games quite similar to me. I think we check very similar ideas, and we sometimes have different conclusions. No, I put that in wrong. That was supposed to be negative, not positive. But Deli and I came out very similar here in how we handle randoms. We had similar rates of corner versus non-corner starters. He actually plays a few more corners than I do, which I didn't see coming. And similar rates of lots of different structural choices. I suspect we sometimes choose different cards, but also when playing him, at least recently, I've had quite a good rate of predicting his moves because I thought, what's the worst thing that could happen here? And he played the move I was most worried about. So I do think we have some differences in our play, and you'll see our tournament marks will land really different. But recently we've been playing quite similar stylistically in randoms. Who else ends up in this safety section? Oh, Bot Club Spade is a bot you might think should end up over here. And indeed, he does. Not as strongly as me or Deli, but Spade ends up clearly in the section. Most of the top players I looked at were a little bit on the defensive side and a little could go either way, initiative to concrete. So kind of that space between Vialva, Spade, and Tournament Deli and Piggy Deli was the most crowded area on the graph. And it was nice to see, of the initial bots, Spade is the only one that lands. And I've put in small samples for the bots. I don't have a ton of their games in yet. But Spade was the only one to land as a really conventional player. The others tended to look like extremes in one direction or another. And lastly, we got the forceful section. And one thing I'm thinking about while doing this is it would be interesting, like, you see a player that looks similar to you on this, and maybe you think of them as similar, maybe you don't, but it gives you something to think, oh, maybe that's a player's games to check out. Maybe they'll be doing something interesting that I can look at and see someone who sees things a little similarly to how I do, but has some different things to offer. Similarity scores could be interesting. There are some sports where they are. But you might also look at this and think, like, say you're Delhi and you're like, Waz doesn't play anything like me. This is a stupid scoring system. And that might be the correct conclusion. We have put a bunch of work into it. That doesn't mean it's any good. I think it's interesting, and I'm going to have fun charting different players over time. Now, something goofy here is our first example of a forceful player is going to be a really poor player. It's going to be club, bot club, club. But this is clearly a forceful player, right? They capture everything, forcing narrow paths to the game, right? This is clearly on the aggressive side, and it's clearly very much on the forces the action immediately side, the concrete side, making this a forceful player. I think this is the correct score for club. But what was really amusing to me was club is actually, I think, my most similar player for my tournament performance. And my tournament performances have been really good. So landing right next to club here, like just on top of club, was pretty funny to me. That in the squares we're playing, club is playing randoms, I'm playing tournaments. Again, people's styles change between random and tournaments. You can see I move from very comfortably in the safety category to mostly concrete, but clearly in the forceful category between random and tournaments. The structures and the setups I'm going for are somewhat different in hand games versus random games. Everyone's going to move. Some are going to move a lot more than others, though. And so this is an example of someone moving, but I also just thought it was funny that my most similar player is club. Because I'm pretty good, and club's not so good. Another example in the forceful space was Turd's tournament play, which we'll put in now. Also over in this space. Generally tended to be closer to the middle line, the up-down middle line, than the left-right middle line. The players in this category tended to be very concrete and a little bit aggressive, rather than very aggressive and not very concrete. It's possible the way we've scored it that it's just really hard to come out certain parts of the graph. You can see there's generally an upright trajectory to things, and I think that is, you know, going from the bottom left to the top right, there is definitely some correlation between intuitive and aggressive and between concrete and defensive. We didn't make them entirely uncorrelated, so players cannot really end up everywhere, but there are going to be some changes, and it may come out better calibrated on this front, so players can really end up plausibly anywhere on the graph. Lastly, I thought I should give some examples of players that are pretty neutral, pretty close to that middle line. And Akiyama's tournament performance is, I think, is it the most balanced here? Well, there's three that are really close. So we'll start with Akiyama's tournament play. His non-tournament play lands differently, but his tournament play was one of the closest to the middle we had. And it has now popped up. Technically very slightly in the safety category, but really close to that middle point. Seto in tournaments is also really close to that middle point. But unlike Akiyama, is slightly above center. You can't see his dot, so I'll actually remove Akiyama so you can see it. But it's basically Akiyama's, but just the same north of the border of that line. So slightly above there, I'll put Akiyama back now. And the other one really close to being neutral was Piggy's tournament performances, where he seems to get more defensive in randoms, and when he has hands, when he has built-in synergies, he is more comfortable making aggressive moves, at least in the sample we took. And so I will put in Piggy here. Again, I'm happy to do other players. I mostly checked, so you can sort of see his dot. I mostly checked the big names and some of the bots because I was curious how the bots would land. For instance, is there any other bot that looks interesting? I think not yet. We'll save them for another video. But these were a bunch of the players I looked at and where they landed. And if you would like to know where you place on this chart, or who's a player that's maybe similar in style, and maybe not, maybe you'll think they don't line up at all, because there are lots of different move types that can get you to a similar score, and maybe they play all the ones you don't play. You know, maybe Seto gets here by playing moves that are in all directions, and he ends up in the middle because he plays moves that are so much of each category, right? And someone else gets to the middle by playing very neutral moves, very balanced moves. Those will end up with the same net score, but they are very different ways to get there. So this is not, you know, necessarily saying people are similar here. I do think at this point in time, Delial and I see randoms quite often pretty similarly. And even when we make quite different moves, they are in similar squares. So I think that one at least checks out. I think Deuce and Joker being off on the chaotic side and more chaotic than humans are also checks out. Humans will just grab the safety, often correctly, much more than they will. So yeah, if you want your score checked, I do need to have tournament examples or random tournaments. Like you don't have to have played, you know, official tournaments, or if you have played officials and you know you went out in the first round each time in one game, that's going to be a really small sample. But if you've played weekly opens, I probably have enough games I can put together a thing. You could also ask for something like, for instance, if you're Yevon, I think Yevon played really differently in the Fun GB from 2021, the November GB, than he has in recent times. And it might be interesting to plot how was Yevon playing at the end of 2021 versus how is Yevon playing now, late 2022 or early 2023. We can also do that kind of divide as well as random versus tournament. I hope this looks interesting. I hope it seems like I defined it well. I'd love feedback. I'd be happy to make some tweaks if you think the results are ridiculous. If you know you are one of the players listed here and you're like, I play way more defensively than Spade does, how did I end up, you know, wherever, fire away. Yeah, I'm happy to engage on this stuff. I just thought it would be fun to make a chart that wasn't about skill but was about what types of moves are players making. Because, you know, if there's cards in 1 and 5, right? Some people will play in 8 and set up a J. Some people will play in 9 more and set up a slash. Some people will attack immediately and play in 2 or 4. Some people will play really high combo setup moves in 3 or 7. And, you know, most people won't do the same thing every time. But there's a whole bunch of choices there. And this is going to identify certain players doing similar things in a lot of those spots repeatedly. And so some players are going to do a little bit of everything, and they're probably going to end up landing near the center. And some players are going to do maybe a tiny bit of most things, but are really going to do a few things first, are really going to prioritize those. And you're going to see those players cluster somewhat together and also cluster in some direction on the board, depending on what moves it is. So that's where we got with our style rankings. And yeah, ask me where you land. I'd love to go find more people. Also, this is not final by any means. Again, we have a bunch more move types to score. We are only scoring within the first 4 moves because move 5 onwards, quite often it's just taken over by calculation. Depending on the player, that'll start at a different point, but cutting it at move 4 felt safe to never have it be, or rarely have it be, a pure calculation decision. So that style could shine through. But it does mean it misses something on that end. Some people clearly find quite different moves 5 and 6 than other players, and they will not get proper attribution here. We have not finished putting in all moves, so especially moves 3 and 4 that make a big difference on the aggressive defensive scale are not yet included here and will be soon. So the concrete intuitive scale is pretty set in, but the aggressive defensive scale, players could move around quite a lot on that. So it could be that Vialva goes flying into the chaotic section, or that, my tournament play actually lands as somewhat defensive and is much closer to my random play than it looks here. That's yet to be determined. These are far from final, but I like this as a visualization, and I hope you do too.